Okay, it looks like we are at time. Welcome everybody. My name is Zoltan Sarda. I'm with the Performance Assessment part of CTC. It is my pleasure to be facilitating this meeting with Dr. Kitty Fortner and Dr. Marco Nava. I'd just like to do a brief introduction of them, and then I will turn the meeting over to them. Dr. Kitty Fortner is an assistant professor at California State University, Dominguez Hills, in graduate education, working in the school leadership program, and is a lead assessor for Cycle 2. She is deeply committed to helping leaders develop the mindset and disposition needed to lead for liberation in school, where all children are valued for who they are and what they bring to the learning space. Her research interests are leadership identity, leadership, disposition skills, knowledge and behavior, transformative leadership, and liberation leadership. She is mom of 2 fur babies, an avid plumeria grower, and enjoys traveling when there's no COVID. And I hope you can get back to traveling soon. So Dr. Marco Nava has served school communities in diverse educational settings in Los Angeles. As the administrator of induction and credentialing in the Los Angeles Unified School District, he provided coaching and professional growth opportunities for aspiring leaders and experienced administrators. In 2014, he was American Councils for International Education Fulbright Fellowship. He has presented research on school improvement, teacher pedagogy, learning, and leadership development at various national and international educational conferences. And we will be, you can put questions in the chat, but Dr. Fortner and Dr. making questions at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. So we are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome and thank you for joining us for this session on utilizing the tools of cultural proficiency to address implicit bias. And Kitty and I are very thankful for your participation. We also want to give a shout out to Dr. Delia Estrada from LA Unified, who was really leading this work. And then also Dr. Letitia Bradley, who they both presented the same session earlier today, did a great job. So hopefully you heard from some of your colleagues about the content from the earlier session. So we'll be repeating that here during the afternoon session. So thank you again. Let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. Here are the outcomes that we're going to try to cover today. We have a short amount of time with all of you, but we want to make the most of it. So our outcomes today is really to build a common understanding of implicit bias. And we know that many of you are probably experts in this area. You may be teaching a course in this. You may have done a great deal of reading on this. And we know that some of you have an advanced level of understanding of this topic. And for others, some of us are maybe learning it a little more so. So let's treat today as a reciprocal learning conversation. Well, we will add to each other's understanding as we go through the day. We're also going to talk a little bit about the tools of cultural proficiency to address implicit bias. So there are definitely some tools that we can use to have these conversations in our programs or at our work sites. And then understand how implicit bias manifests in our work in supporting and scoring performance assessments, or at least supporting people who are going through our induction programs so that they are successful in these areas. Earlier today, when we had the framing from Dr. Sandy, she talked about the 4 pandemics. She was citing Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings' work, the 4 pandemics, and obviously we know about the COVID, and we think of our frontline workers in emergency rooms and hospitals that are supporting people. The one she brought up was racism, specifically anti-Black racism. And if that's one of the pandemics that's being brought up, then we are definitely the frontline workers in leading the charge against anti-racism. So it's up to us to really have these conversations and change structures that are racist or don't serve all of our students equally. And so we'll start that conversation here today, and then we'll move forward. So again, Kitty and I are looking forward to this reciprocal learning conversation moving forward. So let's go on to our next slide. All right, so let's do a quick engagement activity. And we're going to talk about how you would answer this question. And this is one of the activities that comes from cultural proficiency. And you will not have to post in the chat, but if you have a piece of paper or on your phone, if you want to type into your notepad, how would you answer this question? I am not. So thinking about three items, three things where you could say, I am not. So let me model it very quickly for you. So for me, I am Mexican American. I am very creative and I am very empathic. But I am not lazy. I am not dumb. I am not monolingual. So think about three things. Well, I'll give you a minute to think about them. Jot them down to yourselves, and then we'll come back and regroup, and then we'll continue the conversation. So think of three things for each. Let's take a few seconds. All right, so hopefully you had some time to think about that. Now what I will ask you to do is in the chat, not type in what you wrote down, but type in how you felt engaging in this activity. Like, how did that make you feel as you were thinking about these items? So go ahead and start posting into the chat room, letting us know some of the feelings that you may have had or some of the thoughts you had as you were asked to think about three things. Some people are saying they were passionate, they were curious about what others might be thinking, reflective, thank you. Difficult to narrow down to just three in each, definitely. So there's this cognitive struggle that may be going on. Engaged, someone was thinking a lot about what they want to share, right? What they would share if they had that opportunity. They felt valued. Reflection is coming up quite a bit. Thank you for posting this thing. Something that is so simple really can be a reflective piece. And so what we enjoy about this activity is that it gives us an opportunity to think about what we would share if we were asked, right? What we are and what we are not. So it speaks to our identity, our positionality. And then it also makes us think about how others see us. And, you know, that's something that we don't always think about, or it doesn't come up to the forefront. But then we think about how we view others, and then specifically for our students in our schools, how does the system view them? How do the communities view them? And so this is part of that implicit bias where we can be intentional about changing some of this narrative so that we really focus on what students, what our staff, our faculty is saying, who they are and their identity, and that we can value that piece and us not impose what we think about them. So, all right. So someone said it made me feel a little apprehensive, but they felt better once they had done that. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on the posting. All right. So let's go on to our next slide. Have you seen this slide? Does it look familiar? Many of you have probably seen this in some iteration. I see people nodding. So we think about equity versus equality, right? Or equity and equality and what they mean. And we have seen how this has changed over time. We've seen it where there's an example for English learners or emergent bilinguals. So here we see how it's shifted over time. And we think about our systems and who they are supporting, who they're allowing to play in this instance, and then who the participants are, and then what their view may be. And so this session is really intended for us to start thinking about how we start to engage in conversations to move that narrative so that we are engaging all of our students and supporting all of our students in ways that will help them succeed, not just academically, but also in their daily lives, in their social interactions that they move forward in. So, all right, let's go on to our next slide. Thank you, Kitty. We're also going to be talking about cultural proficiency. This is a very quick introduction to the conceptual framework. There are 4 tools that we use in cultural proficiency. So one is the guiding principles, which is on the lower right-hand corner. And these guide some of the work, some of the theory behind culturally proficient practices. Then on the lower left corner are the barriers to cultural proficiency, because this is work that we have to engage in. It's not as easy as we would like it to be. Someone earlier said 90% of the work that we engage in is that ethical tension between cultural proficiency and those barriers, right? Having those conversations, moving that needle forward. And as we go up into the center of our framework, you can see that this is the cultural proficiency continuum, and it's divided into healthy practices and unhealthy practices. And so we're going to dive a little deeper into that in a few slides. And then ultimately at the top, there are some practices that we can engage in that will help us to become culturally proficient and engage in the healthy practices on the cultural proficiency continuum. So we'll get into that in a few minutes. So Kitty, let's move on to our next slide. Sorry, I
didn't realize those were there. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to walk us through a little bit of an experience in helping us to clarify in our own understanding what implicit bias is. So I'd invite you to read this definition, and I'd like for you also to put one word from this definition in the chat that kind of resonates with you. Just place one word in the chat that resonates with you. And Marco is going to monitor the chat while I'm talking. So
unconscious is coming up quite a bit. Automatic, people, stereotypes has been posted. Unconscious again coming up. Big theme, the stereotypes. Thank you for posting. Thank you for your engagement.
Yes. Thank you. So the idea of this unconscious and this automatic, that's where I want to start us out with. That it is a great power that we don't even think about it, right? We don't even, it just happens. It's the way that it is. It's the way that it happens. It's the way that it occurs. And it's not a lot of work. It just occurs. To make it occur, it doesn't take much. And this is really important. It's that it's so ingrained in our sense of normal that we're not even aware of it. So we're going to continue to develop this, our understanding and our definition of implicit bias as we move forward. So let's get to the next slide. I'm going to invite you to look at this video. I'm hoping everything works well. So this is on implicit bias. Let me make sure my sound is set up because I didn't do that before we started. And I know sometimes it doesn't come on well. I got it clicked. So here we go. Let me know if you can hear it.
Implicit bias. Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We've never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
with all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
All right. So the fact of the matter is we are biased. All of us are biased. So before I start this next part, can you drop something in that from that video that maybe helps you to maybe clarify a little bit more about bias and in your definition of bias? So in the chat, if you can put another word or two that that you picked up from the video.
We have someone who'd like to share this with their induction teachers
That's
next.
good.
So we will make all of the resources available to you in that shared folder. We just need a little more time to get all the resources there. But associations, they're ingrained. Someone saying we all have these biases, and yes, we sure do. Unconscious has come up, not the same as racist. Although we know there's a connection, not exactly the same. Association, thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Fog
the fog that we breathe in, that was very interesting, because when we're outside and it's foggy, we don't even know that we're breathing it in, right? So that whole idea of it being unconscious, the whole idea that it's not a flaw, it's not a character flaw, it's not something wrong with us, it's not a test that we failed, it's more of a survival mechanism. We don't always see what happens when we change, our breathing patterns change. If we go into smoky areas and we start coughing, then we know something is happening. But this is what bias is. And the comforting part of this, I think the most comforting part, is that we all have them. We all have biases. And it's, like I said, it's a survival mechanism. But our work is understanding how to unravel these automatic processes to achieve the outcomes that we're striving for. So the biggest piece is to remember why we're doing this. And I want to, we're going to watch another video, and this is John Amici Obi, and his video is very, let's just say, it's going to help us to clarify a little bit more what bias is, implicit bias.
Let's if we can, try to define what exactly is that covert, that subconscious bias. What exactly does that mean?
So I struggle sometimes with the language that we use, because the unconscious is a thing. It is a concept in psychology, and bias is a real thing. But we mix the two together, and it's a very unclear picture. I've talked before about the fact, and you've heard here with Jamelia and others, the things that people have done. And the moment it lives in the real world and not in our head, it stops being unconscious. So if someone walks towards me and because whatever, they cross the street, the act of crossing the street is quite a conscious act. The fact that it's derived from a nebulous, difficult to define feeling that's inside them of discomfort is one thing, but it doesn't make the act of crossing the street, the act of not hiring a person, the act of whatever it is, questioning whether you should be in the neighborhood or whatever, it doesn't make that an unconscious act. So these are subtle behaviors, but if you are on the receiving end of that, it's not particularly subtle. When people cross the street, when they see you coming, it's pretty obvious. And after a while, that trend has a real impact.
So with that, there was a kind of a difficulty in defining that. So if it's so difficult to define, how on earth do you even tackle it?
It's not too difficult. For most people watching this, you will have had a wince moment, a moment that you can think back on right now, where you had an uncomfortable interaction with someone who's different than you. It might be somebody who's perhaps a wheelchair user. It might be an LGBT person. It might be a Black person. But you'll have a wince moment where the differences between you suddenly crystallized in you, and you had a sense of urgency, a sense of panic, a sense of I don't know what to say or do. And you may have even at that point misstepped. You may have even had that wince moment when you just abdicated responsibility to stand up when that sexist joke was told or when that racist thing was said. You can learn from those moments. That discomfort can be a teacher. But what you have to do is acknowledge you have them. One of the problems with defeating this everyday racism is the idea that people don't want to address the fact they think it's the worst thing in the world to consider that they've ever done anything biased, but we all have. Embracing that can prevent us from making the same mistake again. Ignoring that makes us a dangerous weapon in society.
And really quickly, how have you dealt with it? Very quickly, if you can, John. If you can.
I try, as a psychologist, to believe the best in people. I maintain that that is the way forward, and I hope that this will be a pivotal moment for change for everybody.
Okay, John Amici, really good at good talking, and some really good advice there as well. Thank you.
All right. So again, we're going to ask you to drop something in the chat as to what from his video really just helped you to clarify a little bit more about your definition of implicit bias. Each time I watch this video, something always hits me. Sometimes it's the wince moment, like someone just put in, and sometimes it's other things. Today, it was what did I write down? The ignoring it is a dangerous weapon. Ignoring the fact that we have bias, we have implicit bias, is a dangerous weapon. That's what struck me today. I think I heard it really clear today when he was talking, but each time it's something different. So if you want to go through some of those things, Marco, and then we'll continue.
Absolutely. A couple of people also posted the ignoring that piece, right? And we just have to not ignore that, right? Take it on. Someone earlier posted, we have to be intentional about having conversations around implicit bias before they become larger issues. So yes, we're seeing people mention the wince moment. And I think we've all either experienced it or seen it, and we've winced, or we've seen others wince when they do that, because we all have implicit bias, and every once in a while we will take that misstep, and the important thing is to reflect on that and then correct it, right? So yes, definitely. And then must look in the mirror and reflect the truth of your own implicit bias. So yes, there's the
That's good. That's good. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for participating. This engagement makes it even more important for us. So as we think about that, the whole idea that it's unconscious, the whole idea that we can't just ignore it. And many will say it's just not deliberate. It's just it, but nonetheless, it is an overt act which affects people. It affects their opportunity. It affects their lives. It affects the joy that they have. So when we consider our work with the candidates that we are working with, we need to consider what overt consequences does our implicit bias place on them? And if we ignore bias in anything that our candidates are doing, whether it's a submission for a Cal EPA or RECA or wherever they're at, the Cal, whatever, Cal TPA, wherever they're at, if we ignore bias, what overt consequences are we silencing? Are we condoning? What are we doing? So as we continue to think about this idea of ignoring or deliberately just letting things go by, or even unconsciously, I feel like we need to get to my next slide. Sorry. We need to we need to have this aha moment. We need to have this this moment where we stop and we think, wait, what works for whom and under what set of conditions? What is it that we're doing? What is the importance of that? And something to remember is that we are engaged in a system that is getting the outcome that is designed to get, right? And we have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge this idea that what we are designed to do is what we're doing. And so can we see how behaviors work in tandem to create inequalities or inequities? I have one more video that I'm going to share and we're going to look at. But assumptions, beliefs trigger our behaviors. Our assumptions about others trigger our behaviors. I think John talked about people crossing the street when they see someone coming. Sometimes that happens and we don't even think about it. Sometimes it happens out of our thought for safety, but sometimes it happens from other reasons that we haven't thought about. But grooves of behavior are ingrained. These things are ingrained in us and they kind of trap us. So one of the scholars, Bruce Matsue, from Claremont states that our assumptions and beliefs created our world. We create it. So if we wish the world to be different, we need to build it one belief at a time. So our jobs is to find out how just to do this. How do we do this? And what works for whom and under what conditions is what we need to consider at all times. And one of the things, the next clip that we're going to be looking at is going to really hone in on something that we often do not think about, but that is very, very, I don't know if it went to the right one.
This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, the ability to go unexamined, lacking introspection, and in fact being rendered invisible in large measure in the discourse about issues that are primarily about us. And this is amazing how this works in domestic and sexual violence, how men have been largely erased from so much of the conversation about a subject that is centrally about men. And I'm going to illustrate what I'm talking about by using the old tech. I'm old school on some fundamental regards. I make films and I work with, high tech, but I'm still old school as an educator. And I want to share with you this exercise that illustrates on the sentence structure level how the way that we think, literally the way that we use language, conspires to keep our attention off of men. This is about domestic violence in particular, but you can plug in other analogs. This comes from the work of the feminist linguist Julia Penelope. It starts with a very basic English sentence. John beat Mary. That's a good English sentence. John is the subject, beat is the verb, Mary is the object. Good sentence. Now we're going to move to the second sentence, which says the same thing in the passive voice. Mary was beaten by John. And now a whole lot has happened in one sentence. We've gone from John beat Mary to Mary was beaten by John. We've shifted our focus in one sentence from John to Mary. And you can see John is very close to the end of the sentence, well, close to dropping off the map of our psychic plane. The third sentence, John is dropped, and we have Mary was beaten, and now it's all about Mary. We're not even thinking about John. It's totally focused on Mary. Over the past generation, the term we've used synonymous with beaten is battered. So we have Mary was battered. And the final sentence in this sequence, flowing from the others, is Mary is a battered woman. So now Mary's very identity, Mary is a battered woman, is what was done to her by John in the first instance. But we've demonstrated that John has long ago left the conversation. Now, those of us who work in domestic and sexual violence field know that victim blaming is pervasive in this realm, which is to say blaming the person to whom something was done rather than the person who did it. And we say things like, why do these women go out with these men? Why are they attracted to these men? Why do they keep going back? What was she wearing at that party? What a stupid thing to do. Why was she drinking with that group of guys in that hotel room? This is victim blaming. And there are numerous reasons for it, but one of them is that our whole cognitive structure is set up to blame victims. This is all unconscious. Our whole cognitive structure is set up to ask questions about women and women's choices and what they're doing, thinking, and wearing. And I'm not going to shout down people who ask questions about women, okay? It's a legitimate thing to ask. But let's be clear, asking questions about Mary is not going to get us anywhere in terms of preventing violence. We have to ask a different set of questions, and you can see where I'm going.
So again, I want to ask you to put some things in the chat as we finish up and conclude our definition of implicit bias. And this whole idea of questioning what's being questioned, who's being questioned, and how we're asking our question is so important also in the way that we address bias. And we need to address it as an ongoing task. And it's not easy and it's not comfortable, because when we self-examine, when we reflect on our own behavior, our own ideas, our own thoughts, this understanding of language comes into play strongly. And I think about it when I was a principal at a school. I think about it in the way that we address and we, quote, label our students. So that I want to ask you to think about the difference in a student as a homeless student or a student experiencing homelessness, a special needs student or a student receiving individualized services. How do we begin to unravel these attitudes? If just the nuances of those questions right there, or the nuances of those terms that were used right there, can start to bring these assumptions and beliefs to examination. So what steps are we willing to take? What steps are we willing to, how far are we willing to go to get from, oh, yikes, I said that, to, oh, yes, that's the right way to come about this. And so looking at different pieces of evidence, looking at what we're saying and how we're saying it is what we want, what we would love to get started in the work that we're doing. So.
Thank you, Kitty. And they are posting thank you into the chat box. And some people are saying, yes, victim blaming is one way we shift that from the perpetrator to victims. And the parallel within educational institutions is at times we blame students or their families for a failure of our system. And so again, the words matter, the language, the labels, those all matter, very important. And as you were speaking, Kitty, I think about, yes, in schools, how we just quickly label students or we avoid, or we haven't made it a good practice of using the person first language. Thank you, Julie. Julie just posted person first language, right? It's so important that we think about those. So thank you for that piece. Up on the screen, we're looking at the California dashboard. And as you look at it and see the different groups and the labels that we have, and then we see some of the other labels in terms of some of the data, what do you notice about this dashboard that, you know, kind of connects with the video that Kitty just shared with us? You know, what are we seeing on here just in terms of some of these labels? Like I'm looking at it, and the first column right after student groups is chronic absenteeism, then it's suspension rate. Like I would love to see something about student assets. Like what are the assets that our students and their families bringing to our school community, right? Like we're not even starting with a positive on this board. What else do you notice about maybe groups that are not represented on our dashboard? And even some who are there in terms of certain groups, and then the data that isn't appearing on the dashboard. And you can post into the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, we do have a little bit of time and you can share something out. Multilingualism, yeah, we're not necessarily seeing that reflected here as an asset. The color coding is not clear, right? It just becomes this, you know, abstract colors up on the board. There are, exactly, thank you, Michelle. We are missing LGBTQ students, right? We know that that's very important. We have to be able to have systems of support for all of our students. And here it appears we're not even tracking data. And then even for some, there's no data that's appearing for students experiencing homelessness. And we know that they have needs. We know that there's ways that we can support them, but yet we don't have any data for certain groups of students. And so this is some of the shortcomings that we have. Again, institutional, right? These are some of the barriers that we're going to overcome as we're doing this work. Jessica posted family life circumstances as well. So it's difficult to capture, right? What about a happiness index? A lot of us are engaged in doing work with social emotional learning, and we're not tracking some of that. And we know that in many families, even when they're encountering some hardships, there's a great deal of happiness that is happening and that students could bring to our classrooms and schools. So, all right. Okay, so let's go ahead and go on to our next slide. So we talked earlier, or at least we're introduced to the cultural proficiency continuum. And so this is it. And really this is broken down into two parts. The half on the left are the unhealthy practices of cultural proficiency. And then the ones on the right are the healthy practices for cultural proficiency. And you can see that each one, if we start all the way on our far left, it begins with cultural destructiveness. And what comes to mind when we hear destructiveness is really destroying culture. So historically, we could think of the Holocaust, genocides that have occurred throughout the world. So that is cultural destructiveness, trying to eliminate cultures that are others, right? That are different from our own. In school contexts, I can think back to when my siblings would say they weren't allowed to speak Spanish at school. They had to only speak English, even when they were just learning English, because the culture, in a sense, was being destroyed out of the school sites, right? There was no place for it, so to speak. Then as we move to the right, one step over, it's cultural incapacity. So it's trivializing the other. So in a sense, maybe not destroying it, but seeking to make it appear wrong. So like, oh, like this culture engages in this practice, and yeah, that's just wrong, right? Making a judgment, an assessment of it. Moving over one more step to cultural blindness, we may hear things such as, well, I treat all of my students the same. I don't see color, I don't see race, I don't see ethnicity. They're all the same. They're all my same students. And again, when that happens, we see that we may not be providing the appropriate supports for our students. We may be treating some students differently because our implicit biases may kick in. And so we may still be engaging in unhealthy practices that have negative consequences for our students, for teachers, if we're at a school site supporting teachers, or in our programs. So as we shift over to the healthy practices, we have cultural pre-competence, and this is increasingly aware of what we do, increasingly, really informing ourselves, building our own ability, capacity, knowledge base to be able to have those conversations around implicit bias and racism so that we can move the work forward. Cultural competence is manifesting our personal values and behaviors to the school's policies and practices. So now we're really moving institutional change so that it really supports the people who are working there, and most importantly, students who are there enrolled. So this is really, in a sense, promoting the work of diversity. And finally, cultural proficiency is really the value of the diversity and promoting all of the benefits and assets that comes from that. And so for our work, we would love for everyone to be engaged on the healthy side of this continuum. And we will drop the cultural proficiency framework into our resources as well. So you will have a copy of that. So really using that lens of cultural proficiency, again, we can see the unhealthy and the healthy practices. And the goal is to really have our work, our mindset, our dispositions reside in that healthy practice side. Or as Dr. Amici said, if we hear or we do something that may appear to be unhealthy, rather than just that wince, we're proactive in addressing it, in changing that and engaging in a conversation to change mindsets potentially. All right, so let's go on to our next slide. So using the lens of equity-driven leadership of learning, and in order to be an equity-driven leader, here are some of the main points of cultural proficiency is really assessing cultural knowledge, being aware of what we know, being aware of other cultures. So it's just raising that awareness, valuing diversity. This is making an effort to be inclusive of people and viewpoints that may be different from our own, definitely that value piece. And then managing the dynamics of difference, viewing conflict as a natural and normal process that has cultural context that need to be understood, and then we can be more supportive in our classrooms. Adapting to diversity, so that is very critical. Having the will to learn about other cultures, right? And being able to change our educational settings. Earlier, Kitty showed us the slide from Anthony Brick and Louis Gomez in terms of improvement science and seeing that system that produces the intended results. And many of our systems are rooted in that industrial model of education. And so we know the results that we're getting really are by design. It's not accidental. And so now the work is to shift away from that. And then institutionalizing cultural knowledge. So make learning about cultural groups and their experiences and their assets an integral part of our ongoing learning and the learning at our school community. So being intentional, valuing it, promoting it, diversity, so to speak. So, all right, Kitty, let's go on to our next slide.
Okay. So the question is, how do we do this work? How do we make this happen? And our suggestion is that I've heard it said that there's muscles in our bodies, and the more we use those muscles, the better we get at doing whatever it is we're doing. The more that we run and use our leg muscles, the better we become as runners. The more we lift weights and strengthen our arms, the more strength we have in our arms to do the things that we need to do. So how do we build this muscle? How do we strengthen this and build this understanding and this ability to address inequity and bias? It's through reflection and dialogue. We have to continue to learn and to study together even as an organization so that we can address and we can speak. And some of the things that we need to do that is we need to have resources. And I know that you all probably have a ton of resources that you could drop into the chat box, which is what I'm going to ask you to do, into that little chat window. I'd like for you to drop some of your resources that you use in your work as you address implicit bias in the situations where you find yourself. And then on the screen here, you'll see a few that we have found have been helpful in working. And some of these are used in programs, some are used personally, but these are tools to help us to develop that muscle so that we can truly address implicit bias in our work. Thank you. I see people that are already dropping things into the chat.
Yes, we see Coaching for Equity, Elena Aguilar, great book in terms of coaching, but bringing in that equity lens to the coaching piece. Brandy has shared, it looks like it might even be a link directly to that resource, Shattering Inequities, Real World District Leaders. So thank you for sharing.
Okay. And so with that, we just want to remind everyone that, you know, there is a lot out there. There's a lot of resources that are available for us. And we want to, even though we just noted a few, and I'm thankful for people putting them into the chat because that's another source for us to build on. But for us to commit ourselves, and we want to ask you to commit yourselves to this continued commitment to reflection and to dialogue, building our own proficiency, but also what this work means in the work that we're doing with our candidates, with instructors, with the ones who are coming into our realm of influence, and being able to use that this understanding to support them as they go out to work with children and to work with other adults to be the best that they can be at their level too. So, and not just in our own reflection and our own dialogue with ourselves, but in reflection and dialogue with others, bringing these resources to them also. Okay. I think this one is yours. Just some examples.
All right, so items to consider. These are some quotes that we've actually.
That's fine. That's okay. Go for it.
Yeah. We could tag team on it, okay. Kitty. These are quotes that we've actually seen on different type of assessments, like the TPA and the APA. So these are real world examples. So they are quotes of submissions. And so the candidate had said, "It is clear the parents lack self-efficacy and cannot foster this in their children." So definitely an example of bias. So obviously this submission did not pass. You know, one of the things about this piece is that they were talking about this school serves predominantly military families. And so when you think about them saying that the families lack self-efficacy, it just made me wonder, like, wow, like, you know, it takes a great deal of self-efficacy, right, to serve. And so, Kitty, would you like to cover some of the other ones that are here?
Sure, I'll do the second one. It says, all the team members are experienced teachers from white, middle-class, supportive, and loving backgrounds, in contrast to the the school student populations. Now, I don't know what the school's student population is, but there is a huge assumption that it's very different from a white, middle-class, supportive, and loving background. And only white, middle-class, supportive, loving backgrounds seem to be those teachers. It says those teachers from those, and it contrasts. There's something negative about the way that that's laid out. So there is some type of bias there. And I don't want to say what it is because I really don't know what the school population was from this particular group, but I know that they were not white. They probably were not middle class. And these, the person who wrote this obviously thought they were not in a supportive or loving home.
Yes. And so let's go on to our next slide, Kitty. I think we're down to about 5 minutes, and so we might leave a minute or two for some questions. But that's the important piece about having these conversations, if we're program providers, especially in terms of some of that feedback when we do like peer coaching circles in our programs. You know, bias is one of the items on our checklist we should be looking for, right? To have those conversations and to avoid submitting things like this. So, all right, okay, so we have a final closing video, and I will let you know this one is difficult to watch, and this really captures what happens when we don't address implicit bias, and it actually manifests itself in our children. And so let's take a couple minutes to watch this video. Some of you may have already seen this. Again, it might be a little difficult to watch, but let's go ahead and watch the doll test research and experiment.
Here we go.
Quale bambola è bianca? Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona?
Lei.
Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più? Quale bambola è nera?
Mi ha offeso.
Chi?
Tu.
Perché?
Perché mi hai chiamato nera.
Perché ti offendi?
Mi offendi perché altri bambini mi hanno offeso con cattiveria.
No, io non ho usato nessuna cattiveria.
Quello mi sta guardando storto.
Yes, not easy to watch. But if you think about the young age of the participants and the terrible lesson that we've taught them as a society, this is the importance of addressing implicit bias, being those frontline workers, right? Because earlier someone said we have to address it. We have to call it out and have a conversation around it when we hear it, see it, experience it. Because if we don't, then we see how it manifests itself. And we do this even within our educational system. So that's the important piece in terms of addressing these. So we'd like to leave you with this final thought. We don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. So we love our work. We are fully engaged in this process with you. And again, I know we opened earlier this morning with a quote from Gloria Ladson Billings, and I'd like to close our session with one when she's talking about social justice and educational justice. And she said, it's just justice. And for all of us, we are fully engaged in this work. Thank you for joining us on behalf of Dr. Fortner and the team. Thank you for joining us. We will share all of these resources with you. So if you'd like to post a positive kind of closing remark into the chat box so we all walk away motivated, inspired, please do so. Again, thank you for engaging with us in this reciprocal learning conversation. And Kitty, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to close with as well.
No, I would just like to say thank you so much. Thank you for participating, and let's do this work. Let's do this work. It is a work that is needed, and it is a work that we can all do. And I encourage you all to do that work. And we are here to support you. Know that. You have our contacts here and this is from the morning session and from the PM session. You're welcome to make contact with us, and appreciate, again, you all coming out and just learning from us and growing with us, learning with us, I should say. Thank you.
And on behalf of all the participants, I really want to thank you for this. That video never gets easier to watch. And I'm heartened by the number of participants, both in the morning session and the afternoon session, as a testament to the urgency of this issue. So thank you very much for your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You will, everybody. There's one more session, and we will see you in the afternoon.
See you. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Have a good one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.